evening and welcome to you all on this rather grisly evening. Thank you for signing the attendance sheet. And it's my very great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Professor Richard Duff. He is the Emeritus Professor of German at the University of Greenwich and a long-standing member of the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies Committee. His research interests centre on expressionism, German and Austrian exile in Britain, and the theatre in exile. Among his numerous publications and contributions are the Austrian Centre in London, totally un-English, Britain's internment of enemy aliens in 2 world wars, and latterly Foreign Parts, German and Austrian actors on the British stage, 1933 to the 1960s. His talk this evening, though, will focus on 2 German-speaking Czech actors, a fact which affected their reception and their fortunes in Britain. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Jan. Critics have never agreed precisely how many German-speaking refugees came to Britain after 1933. Though perhaps the best estimate, or a good estimate, based on Home Office figures, is that by the outbreak of war, there were about 78,000 German-speaking refugees in the UK. Among them were some 400 theatre professionals, including many actors. Relatively few of these actors, probably less than 30, succeeded in making the transition to the English stage. Among those who did were 2 German-speaking Czech actors, Friedrich Richter and Amy Frank. The experiences of Czech refugees, particularly those who spoke German, has often been a bit marginalised in exile studies. This paper is not really an attempt to redress the balance, it's more to address the question of German-speaking actors in the British theatre. As to Richter and Frank, it's difficult to view their careers separately, not simply because they were married to each other, were both committed communists and frequently acted together, but also because the major turning points in their lives were experienced in common. They were both born, for example, in Bohemia, then still a province of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They both joined the KPD, the German Communist Party, in 1928, were both expelled from Nazi Germany as foreign nationals, which is quite lucky for them because people who weren't foreign nationals got put in concentration camps. And then they were both expelled from the Soviet Union in 1937, which may surprise you and which is a very interesting episode in their lives, but unfortunately that's a different lecture. And finally, they were forced to flee Czechoslovakia in their home country in 1939. Thanks. Richter was born Friedrich Rosenthal in Brno in 1894. He was originally destined for a career in business. As to say, I think his father destined him for a career in business, but he abandoned it in favour of the stage. He trained at the famous Rheinland Theatre in Vienna, adopting the stage name Friedrich Richter. He made his stage debut in 1921 in his hometown, Brno, in a production that also featured an actress called Emilie Frank, who was 2 years younger. They married a year later, continuing their careers together with regular seasons at the Rheinland Theatre and the Deutsches Theater in Prague. Eventually, as most German-speaking actors did, they graduated to Germany joining eventually the Schauspielhaus Düsseldorf in 1928. In the same year, they joined the German Communist Party, the KPD, a commitment which helped to guide the future course of their careers. Or I could have said to dog the future course of their careers, take a pick. Over the next 50 years, they were, in every sense of the phrase, acting for the party. In April 1939, Richter had left Czechoslovakia in difficult and dangerous circumstances. Together with a small group of fellow actors, including the German actor Leo Bieber and the Austrian Paul Demel, he crossed the Czech-Polish border illegally, reaching the safety of the reception camp for refugees at Katowice in Poland. From there, the group followed a very roundabout way to Britain. They went past Sweden, because they couldn't go through Germany, landing eventually at Tilbury. Richter's first impressions of London, recorded in a short memoir to which I will refer several times, were those of displacement. And I quote, "It was as though I'd somehow landed on the moon," he remembered. "I stood in the streets listening to voices and words, and I couldn't understand anything." He travelled without his wife, who was to leave later, and he spent some anxious weeks before hearing that she had reached safety in Katowice. A week later, they had an emotional reunion in St Pancras Station. Once in Britain, they had perhaps fewer material problems than many of their German and Austrian counterparts. As refugees from Czechoslovakia, they became the responsibility of the Czech Refugee Trust Fund, which was set up to administer funds made available by the British government for the relief and resettlement of refugees from Czechoslovakia. Later, the committee's remit was later, the committee's remit was widened to include Germans and Austrians who had found refuge in Czechoslovakia after 1933. By December 1939, the CRTF was supporting some 12,000 refugees. They embraced a high proportion of political refugees, including a group of some 400 communists, leaving the British government in the somewhat uneasy position of sponsoring a large number of left-wing activists. It wasn't their original intention, of course. These activists ranged from party functionaries to writers, artists, or actors, like Amy Frank and Friedrich Richter. Richter lost no time in starting work after his arrival in London. Speaking not very much English, I've never discovered precisely how much he spoke, but not a lot. He turned to the German Refugee Theatre, acting in a revue called Going, Going, Gone, produced at the Arts Theatre in August 1939. Performed by an ad hoc company called the 420 Black Sheep, in a mixture of English and German, the review aimed to alert the British to the imminent danger of war. Richter appeared in several sketches, including one called The Emperor's New Clothes, based, as you can imagine, on the Hans Andersen fairy tale, which was used to expose the conceit of fascist declarations of peaceful intent. Featuring Hitler, played by Richter, and Mussolini, played by his compatriot Paul Demel, the sketch aroused the displeasure of the British authorities, who, still pursuing apparently the illusion of peace for our time, were anxious to avoid protests from the German embassy, which they duly received, of course. Richter could claim the distinction of being the first actor to make his London stage debut playing the part of Adolf Hitler. though his performance is now very little known, having receded behind the more famous portrayal by Martin Miller. There were one or two other people who did it as well. It was rather a favourite, of course, with exiled actors. German political cabaret was a novelty in London, and the review attracted great interest. Every performance was sold out, and the planned one-week run was extended for a further 3 weeks owing to enormous success. However, Going, Gone was the one and only production of the 4 and 20 Black Sheep. Within a month, war had broken out, scattering the actors and banishing any idea of a further production. After war was declared, the authorities considered the concentration of refugees in London undesirable and evacuated some of them. That was their phrase. So you see, it wasn't just children who were evacuated in wartime Britain, it was also certain foreign nationals. Richardson and Frank were sent to Birkenhead, which I don't think they'd ever heard of, receiving accommodation in a CRTF hostel, Refugee Trust Fund hostel, which was actually a large mansion that had been requisitioned to house refugees. In his own account, which is actually called Auf Theater Tour in England, Richter recalled, "There began a busy winter for my wife and me. They arranged a weekly programme of theatre activities, firstly for the residents of the hostel, and later for those in the surrounding neighbourhood, visiting local clubs and church halls. Their performances included Brecht's one-actor Der Spitzel, the spy, and the rustic scenes from A Midsummer Night's Dream. They were both very anxious to master the English language for obvious reasons, choosing to improve their comprehension by watching performances at the Liverpool Playhouse, whose director, William Armstrong, gave them complimentary tickets once a week. They came across him later in their English careers. Like other refugee artists, Richter and Frank found a lifeline through the BBC German service, which recruited them in April 1940, enabling them to return to London precisely a year after they had escaped from Prague. Over the next 12 months, the BBC offered them their only chance to perform. They worked as occasional announcers for the German service, but more frequently as actors in feature programmes. Features, as many of you may know, were in fact short dramatic sketches, often of a satirical nature, which were intended to leaven the usual, perhaps boring diet of news programmes, or repetitive diet, shall we say. While the job gave them financial independence, Richter did not enjoy broadcasting, which he found monotonous. I'm going to quote from the memorandum he wrote. "Every week the same thing happened. You stand in front of the microphone and read something or other, sometimes an acting part, then something political, and then nothing. While the BBC provided the couple with a living, a modest living, it was the Laterne, the Austrian cabaret theatre, which gave them the chance to appear on stage. At the invitation of Martin Miller, Richter appeared in the review Magic Lantern, Laterne Magica, with which the Laterne reopened in June 1941. He acted in several sketches, including one called Ring Rund, Around the Ring, as in Vienna, written by the young Erich Fried, in which he played a political dissident newly released from Dachau, who defiantly declared he'd been right about the Nazis all along. He also played a dramatic role in Nestroy's Der Talisman, directed by Martin Miller, which opened on the 31st of December 1941. Now, it seems to me a very peculiar opening night, Although I helped to write a book about the Austrian Centre, I can't frankly remember whether they often chose it as an opening night date. But anyway, that's when this one opened. It was 1942 which heralded eine große Veränderung, a great change, of course, in the lives of Richter and Frank, as each in turn graduated to the English stage. Richter received an offer from the Oxford Playhouse to play a character called Otto Brandt in Sidney Howard's Alien Corps, a role in which his German accent was an asset, not a handicap. Sidney Howard, by the way, was in the 1930s. He was an American dramatist who was very well known in the 1930s. Wrote a number of plays, all of which got shown on Broadway and/or filmed. So it wasn't a nothing play in a modest production that they appeared in. Richter's first appearance in the English theatre followed in the footsteps of fellow exile Friedrich Walck, who had played the part in the West End 2 years earlier. Richter's performance was highly praised, and he was offered a second part in the Playhouse, in another play by Sidney Howard called They Knew What They Wanted. Richter remembered very little about it, but he did remember that it contained long stretches of dialogue, which of course he had to learn. And he spent many hours learning the lines with the help of his wife, whose English, I think, was not much better than his. So that must have been a rather strange session. In his short memoir, called incidentally Auf Theatertour in England, Richter commented on this experience of repertory theatre in Britain. The Oxford Playhouse produced a new play every week. How is it possible for the actors in Oxford to churn out a play in just 6 days? The 7th day is Sunday, where no performances or rehearsals take place. How is that possible? Well, in the first place, they were all pure conversation pieces. And secondly, the actors were brilliantly practiced. Certainly, a director is named in the programme, and this person even sits in the stalls during rehearsal. But he very wisely keeps silent. He can't afford to hold up the rehearsal by giving any hints or advice. The rehearsal time consists of 6 times 4 hours, half an hour of which is devoted to the coffee break, when you go to the foyer to drink coffee and become absorbed in chatting to the charming English colleagues. Short rehearsal times were exacerbated, in his case, of course, by the difficulties of performing in a foreign language. He refers more than once to learning lines in English, confirming that lines in a still unfamiliar language were, of course, much more difficult to learn. It takes you about twice as long. His problems in mastering English were shared by most other emigres on the English stage, as I'm sure you'll realise. And that includes some of the famous ones who went on to play regularly in the English theatre. Richter never lost his German accent, but he proved highly adaptable. He anglicised his name to Frederick, a wise step in wartime London for any German speaker, even one with a Czech passport. In spring 1942, he was invited to join the Old Vic Company for a 10-week tour as Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, the role having been relinquished by another refugee actor, Frederick Falk, with whom he had played in Prague. Falk recommended Richter as his successor. However, there was little time to rehearse for the tour, in which the company visited industrial towns in Lancashire and Yorkshire, performing mainly in non-theatrical venues. That was the point of this Old Vic tour, to perform theatre to non-theatre goers, if you like. The audiences were largely factory workers, or anyway working class, whose traditional entertainment was probably variety, and who had mostly no experience at all of legitimate theatre. But the actors were delighted with their spontaneous reactions and comments. Old Vic tours always comprised 2 productions shown alternately. On this tour, the second production was The Merry Wives of Windsor, which, according to Richter, delighted the working-class audiences, which is good because it's a comedy. The Merry Wives played their tricks on the old drunkard Falstaff, this is a quote from him, to the enjoyment and hearty laughter of the audience. But at the same time, the fate of Shylock, cheated of his prize, moved the audience deeply on every occasion. Shylock was, of course, a role of great significance for German-speaking refugees, so many of whom were Jews. Richter described his interpretation of Shylock as a man both sinned against and sinning. He described it in these words: "I played the role as the director wanted, which corresponded perfectly to my own interpretation. I played the man who'd been wronged, who'd been scorned and insulted by a society of idlers, and who nursed a burning hatred for his persecutors. This hatred ruled Shylock, dictating all his actions. To satisfy it, he insisted on his bond, and he who loved money so much, refused it, wanting only revenge. The public understood that, and their sympathy was completely with Shylock." Richter's performance received some outstanding reviews, mainly of course in local papers, since these were productions in local theatres. Such as, I'll quote just one, "In Frederick Richter, the company had a Shylock who was able to stir the very depths of sympathy and tragedy. He is an actor who puts his entire personality into the role, whatever role. His gestures are more expressive than the words of many other actors." Richter acknowledged the generous help of the actress Frida Jackson, who set about coaching his English pronunciation and delivery, which was obviously in some need of improvement still. This is a quote from his memo. "The guardian angel and inspiration of my success was Frida Jackson, the actress playing Mrs. Ford in The Merry Wives. My English had to be carefully cut to shape, so that the splendid nuances of Shakespeare's sentences received the attention they deserved. And Frida was there for this time-consuming work. We walked up and down for hours in the park at Preston, where the first night took place, while she recited the role to me word by word and sentence by sentence. I had to learn the part in this way, and we didn't have much time." Richter's enthusiasm for the old Vic was unequivocal. This 10-week tour as Shylock was the most impressive thing that I experienced overall as an actor in England. Mutual respect, love of their profession, and enthusiasm for the work in hand. This is the spirit of the old Vic. He admired the team spirit of his fellow actors, who every Saturday night would break camp after the evening performance, pack up the scenery, costumes and properties to be transformed on Sunday to the next venue. That's the life of the touring company, of course. The tide had by now turned decisively in Richter's favour. 2 months later, he made his London debut in a long-forgotten play by Michael Egan called Salt of the Earth, which opened at the Vaudeville Theatre in the Strand on the 9th of July 1942. Vaudeville, of course, is still there. This was an ambitious production, directed by the actor and composer Dennis Arundel, with costumes by Norman Hartman, a #1 designer, of course. It was a highly topical play. According to the theatre programme, and I quote, "The action of the play takes place in the living room of a farmhouse in Normandy. It covers the period of the fall of France. It concerns a French peasant family who risked their own lives by sheltering an English pilot. A British agent, who was played by John Slater, arrives to help the phantom army of the French resistance. Richter, perhaps inevitably, was cast not as part of the French family, but as a soldier in the German army of occupation, called by the unsurprising name of Schmidt. The critics acknowledged the play's propaganda message. The Evening Standard wrote, and I quote, Michael Egan has written a sincere and sometimes moving play, concluding, Salt of the Earth isn't merely a page of history. It's an appeal to every Englishman not to forget France. Unfortunately, the play ultimately failed to convince either critics or audiences, running for only about 6 weeks. Richter's next play, by contrast, was enormously successful. His agent sent him the script of a comedy with 2 parts for foreigners. The play was an American comedy, Claudia, in which both Richter and Frank were to appear for the next 2 years. The couple were invited to audition for the show's American backer, Lee Ephraim. The audition was held at Palace Theatre, which some of you may know, still there, a large auditorium used for musical shows, where Richard Tauber had entranced audiences in the Land of Smiles. Standing on the huge stage, it is a huge stage, in an empty theatre before an audience of 2, Ephraim and the agent Blackburn, who were seated in the front row of the stalls, Richter wondered if their words would even be audible. But they impressed their small audience and were both offered a contract on the spot. Claudia, the story of a marriage, was written by a popular novelist and Hollywood screenwriter called Rose Franken, who was already well known in London. Claudia came with the momentum of huge success on Broadway, but critics were divided about the merits of the play itself. The Times suggested that some might wonder what American audiences had seen in it, acting that everybody will agree that the play is beautifully acted, noting the prolonged applause at the final curtain. In fact, the play had a rather episodic plot, I would call it, but its theme, which is that of a young woman's early experience of marriage, complete with faux pas and comic disasters, proved very popular with theatre audiences, especially amid the rigours of wartime. It ran for 18 months and 558 performances before beginning a provincial tour lasting a further 8 months. I should add that long playing times were probably not that unusual in wartime, largely, of course, because if you took one production off, you had to find another one, which meant also finding lots of actors, many of whom may have been in the army or what have you. So, if you could keep a production going, they did. Frank and Richter played Bertha and Fritz, the family's faithful servants. So they weren't major roles, but they were good minor roles, whose job was to be comically tolerant of the foibles and weaknesses of their young mistress. That was what most of the comedy depended on, so they were essential to the effect of the play. Although these were supporting roles, they contributed significantly to the play as a whole, and their performances didn't pass unnoticed. The critic of The Spectator, for example, commented that Amy Frank and Frederick Richter, as the foreign servants, had a wonderful touch of the purest continental sentiment. I'm quite sure what that means, but I'll leave you to work that one out. Continental flavour, I assume. It's the first time they actually acted together on the English stage, though they frequently acted together in Germany. After the first night, Lee Ephraim told Richter, "Your wife is very good." Despite this compliment, Richter noted that his wife was paid far less than he was, even though their respective parts were of equal length and importance. It probably may make you wonder how long such circumstances have been going on. Richter always remembered one aspect of the production. As a practicing communist, as audiences began to decline, the producer told the cast that he would continue the play's run only if they agreed to a wage cut. A not uncommon practice in the London commercial theatre, of course. I think it still goes on. The Richters managed to involve equity, which, in view of a planned provincial tour, succeeded in uniting the cast behind the proposal that Ephraim could close the production if he wanted to, but if he wanted to continue the run, it must be on the terms originally agreed. Ephraim eventually gave way, the run continued, and equity was able to celebrate a rare victory. Started, of course, by these German visitors. The provincial tour began in April 1944 and lasted until Christmas, visiting 36 towns in 36 weeks, which I think is not unusual. In a notoriously unreliable profession, the play provided Richter and Frank with continuous employment for over 2 years. Richter recalled the rewards, but also the eventual tedium and strain of such a lengthy tour, calling it a treadmill. Richter's short memoir focuses entirely on the theatre, because he was a stage actor really, ignoring the film roles that he played. But in fact, like other actors, he found film acting an economic necessity. In 1942, he had a small part in a film called Squadron Leader X. Still credited as Friedrich Richter, he played a minor part as Inspector Ziegel in what was greeted as a major film, graced by fine performances from the British actor Eric Portman, who used to play a lot of German parts, and the Austrian actor Martin Miller. In the same year, Richter played in The Adventures of Tartu, a film known for a swashbuckling performance by the popular actor Robert Donat. Robert Donat was a secret agent who goes undercover impersonating a Romanian fascist, the Tartu of the title, in order to find and sabotage a German poison gas factory. German poison gas factories were a very popular motif in British war films. I suspect that they were portrayed slightly more often than they actually existed, although they did exist as well. The film was MGM's first production in Britain, shot in summer 1942, though not released until a year later in October 1943. Wikipedia describes it as, and I quote, a typical flag waver of the era, which I think is probably spot on from what I've read. Then continuing with jaunty inaccuracy, that the film had an American director but an all-British cast. The all-British cast included the German Walter Griller, the Austrian Martin Miller, and the Czech Friedrich Richter, just for starters. And the British-born, the American actor was in fact British, born and bred. More recent critics have praised the performance of Griller as Inspector Otto Vogel and Richter as the Nazi officer General Wehrmacht. I quote, "There's a good supporting cast of German heavies. Walter Griller and Friedrich Richter in particular are excellent as the sort of movie Nazis who showed up the year before at Rick's Cafe in Casablanca." So you'll get the general drift of the film, I think. That was a review, of course, written some years later. Richter's short memoir of theatre life closes with the end of the war, drawing an apparent line under his career in Britain. In fact, he and his wife spent a further 3 years in post-war Britain, during which time Richter appeared in 3 more plays in London, none of which was entirely successful. The first one was The Shouting Dies, a new American play performed in October-November 1945. It marked the beginning of a fresh era for the lyric Hammersmith, where new management proposed to introduce new and experimental plays. Billed as Frederick Richter, he shared the acting honours with fellow refugee Gerhard Hinze and the British actor John Slater. Many West End critics apparently found the journey to Hammersmith too far. Only 3 reviews were ever posted, and even they found the play wanting, criticising the writing, not the acting. Nonetheless, the play ran for its scheduled span of 2 months. It was a full year before Richter performed again, appearing at the Arts Theatre in Alec Clune's production of On the Way, written by a Norwegian dramatist. The Arts Theatre was then, and still is, as you probably know, very close to Leicester Square, actually on Charing Cross Road. Alec Clunes was the father of the modern TV actor Martin Clunes. Alec Clunes, was keen to stage modern foreign drama, which the war had effectively kept off the British stage, and you can understand why. But On the Way proved a controversial choice. The plot, with its theme of female emancipation, concerned a young, unmarried doctor who discovers she is pregnant. She decides to keep the child, but refuses to marry the child's father, or any other of a number of suitable candidates, suitable in inverted commas, of course. Richter played the role of the young woman's father, a man of liberal opinion, who, all the same, cannot understand his daughter's attitude. His performance was well received. The Times critic, for example, praised the actors, and I quote, "Mr. Michael Godfrey is the emancipated idealist, stirred to the depths of his mysticism by Celia's refusal to give him his child. To balance this, there is Mr. Frederick Richter's beautifully moving account of the liberal-minded father, wounded not merely by his family pride, but by the certainty of what his daughter must eventually suffer for her flouting of public opinion." Busy with film commitments, Richter did not appear again on stage for over a year. In April 1948, he played in the comedy Royal Circle, starring Sir Ralph Richardson, for which success in the West End seemed preordained. Richardson, of course, as I'm sure many of you will remember, was one of the 3 biggest stars in the West End theatre at the time, out-and-out stage actor. Billed as a Ruritanian comedy, the play was obviously intended as a satire on international political rivalries. It was set in Lothar, a small kingdom encircled by mountains which had shielded it from the war. Think Switzerland, in other words. Until the discovery within its borders of a substance more deadly than uranium suddenly brings the country to the attention of the great powers. Royal Circle was previewed in Manchester in March 1948, opening in London a month later at Wyndham's Theatre. The London first night was anticipated as an auspicious theatrical occasion, worthy of Ralph Richardson's return to the West End and marking his stage reunion with his wife Muriel Forbes. Richardson played the king of Lothar, while his wife, an accomplished light comedy actress, was cast as his mistress. Richardson, perhaps appropriately, played somebody called Sergei Voronsky, a Soviet delegate to an international conference in Lotovany. A long scene, which is practically, I think, the second act of the play, which was judged the best part of the play. All seemed set for a West End hit. The critic Cecil Wilson, writing for the Daily Mail, I remember, described the scene for his readers. This was an occasion. Stars thronging the stalls, fans swarming outside on a film premiere scale, and together again on stage, Sir Ralph Richardson and his wife Muriel Forbes. A distinguished occasion, yes, but only an occasionally distinguished play. Richardson, who also directed the play, seems to have misjudged the quality of the script, which happens, of course. The writer, Romilly Cavan, evidently aspired to writing a witty Shavian satire. But critics considered the play to be only occasionally witty. The review in The Spectator was typical of many. There is, in Lotovany's paradoxical predicament, a potentially interesting and comic situation. The play is obviously meant to be funny. It obviously could be funny. It is, in fact, inexorably dull. Even Sir Ralph Richardson cannot enlist more than passing interest in a king who has no existence off the West End stage, and very little indeed on it. The first night audience gave the play a mixed reception, described by the Daily Telegraph as politeness from the stalls, disfavour from the gallery. The gallery proved right. Interest in the play cooled very rapidly, and it closed after only 38 performances. It was, unfortunately, Richter's farewell appearance on the English stage. Claudia had provided both Richter and Amy Frank with work for over 2 years. For Richter, it was the peak of his career in Britain. For Frank, however, Claudia was no more than a breakthrough. She had also experienced the debilitating effects of such a long-running production. Writing several years later, in a short memoir, she commented, "If you were lucky and the play you were in was a success with the public, you had the doubtful pleasure of playing it 900 times without a break, except for Sundays." However, it had introduced her to a wide audience, leading, of course, to a number of further parts on stage and screen. In 1945, she appeared in The First Gentleman, played by the British writer Norman Ginsberg, who specialised in historical plays. The production starred Robert Morley, whom I'm sure many of you will remember, as Prinny, the Prince Regent, and later, obviously, William IV. Wendy Hiller as his daughter, Princess Charlotte, and Amy Frank as his discarded wife, Caroline of Brunswick. The production's pre-London tour opened at the Opera House, Manchester on the 1st of April 1945. Not a good date, I think. It later moved on to Liverpool, where Frank experienced the end of the war in Europe on the 8th of May 1945, an event which prompted the personal question whether she and her husband should return to Central Europe. Meanwhile, there was work to be done. The First Gentleman opened in London at the New Theatre on the 18th of July 1945. As a glamorous costume drama with a distinguished cast, the play matched the desire of post-war audiences for a theatrical luxury that transcended post-war austerity. The play became an instant hit, eventually running for 654 performances. The plot centres on the Prince Regent's efforts to marry his daughter Charlotte to a suitable Dutch prince, only for her to reject his choice, following her heart to marry the impoverished Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg, who also provided some ancestors for the British royal family, of course. Critics were enthusiastic about the play, praising Norman Marshall's direction and singling out several fine performances. The Sunday Times called the play good theatre and at times excellent entertainment. Mr. Robert Morley fills both the eye and the mind. He is a rather stout person, as you know, so it's probably a good way of describing him. A beautifully sustained performance. The very moving performance of Princess Caroline by Miss Amy Frank. This is done to the life. Princess Caroline was a cameo role, let's be frank. It was not a leading role, it was a cameo role, but a very good one. One which gave Frank considerable scope to impress, and impress she did. The Spectator commented, for example, that there are moments in the scene between Princess Charlotte and her mother, the unhappy Caroline, Princess of Wales, most admirably played by Amy Frank, which are truly touching. Following its success on stage, The First Gentleman became a film, produced by British Columbia and directed by Alberto Cavalcanti. The only member of the stage cast to appear in the film was Amy Frank, reprising her role as Princess Caroline, with Cecil Parker acting the role of Prinny and Joan Hopkins as Princess Charlotte. Some scenes were shot in the Brighton Pavilion, first time it had been used as a film location. Appropriately, the film was then premiered in Brighton on the 28th of April in 1948, gaining appreciative reviews which unanimously praised Amy Frank's outstanding performance. Miss Joan Hopkins as Princess Charlotte is charming to look at. Wait for it. But the acting honours go to Miss Amy Frank as the forlorn Princess Caroline. She has a small part, but brings it so acutely to life that she casts a shadow over all the others. The sort of actress that other actors often don't enjoy acting with. The film marked the peak of Frank's British career, confirming her as a character actor of some talent. Against this theatre background, Frank and Richter were also playing out the drama of their own lives. By mid-1948, they'd gained a hard-won place on the English stage and could reasonably anticipate further stage and film opportunities. Despite this, at a time when many exiles were seeking British naturalisation, they abandoned relative security of London in favour of Berlin, which was perhaps the epitome of insecurity. Berlin, with the start of the Berlin blockade, had become, of course, the cockpit of the Cold War in Europe. Their reasons for returning to the continent were partly linked to political circumstances, but also reflected the shortcomings of West End theatre in their eyes. Although established in London, Amy Frank did not feel at home there. She later commented that the West End theatre wasn't, I quote, a superficial form of entertainment, unconcerned with any real social problems. So the problem, of course, for them both was to find a theatre somewhere that might offer them better parts. It's truism that the journey into exile is a journey of no return. For Frank and Richter, there was no prospect of returning home to Czechoslovakia. After 1945, Czechoslovakia was convulsed by social and political upheaval as the new government of Edward Beneš introduced the so-called Beneš decrees, enforcing the mass deportation of the country's ethnic German population, and there was still an awful lot of them, of course. For Richter and Frank, the conclusion was inescapable. If there was no ethnic German population in Czechoslovakia, it inevitably meant that there was no German-speaking theatre, which of course served the German population. So they could have returned there, but they chose not to. They returned instead to Germany. accepting an invitation from a former acquaintance, I think, and Communist Party member, the director of Wolfgang Langhoff, to join the ensemble of Berlin's famous Deutsches Theater, once the home of Max Reinhardt for Hitler. Max Reinhardt's favourite theatre in Berlin. That was only until it was requisitioned by girls, of course. The theatre stood firmly in the Soviet sector of Berlin. Berlin was, of course, divided into four sectors of the so-called Allies, who were no longer were. In the Soviet sector, shortly to be designated the capital of the German Democratic Republic, the GDR. Richter and Frank were thus returning to what they might have regarded as a linguistic and political homeland, in which they could pursue theatrical careers closer to their aspirations. How far the really existing socialism of the GDR and the socialist theatre of the GDR was what they hoped and envisaged is impossible to say. They were both wise enough not to write a memoir on the GDR because it wouldn't have been published anyway. Richter remained with the Deutsches Theater in 1970. It suited him perfectly. Theatre records confirm that he played many leading classical roles, varying from Lessing's Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise, Schiller's Wallenstein, to Shakespeare's Othello. It's a role he particularly liked. Amy Frank too appeared regularly at the Deutsches Theater, but after 1960 she devoted herself particularly and mainly to film work, working at the famous DEFA studios in Babelsberg. The couple's marriage, which lasted over 60 years, ended with Frank's death in 1980. Richter outlived her by 4 years, dying just short of his 90th birthday. Together in life, they are together in death, buried together in Berlin's Französischer Friedhof. Their unremarkable gravestone states quite simply that they were long-serving members of the Deutsches Theater. It makes no mention at all of their years on the London stage. Thank you.